an effort to persuade. Good evening. Tonight I'm going to talk about what I've done since ASSAP. Firstly, I set up a Facebook group called Borderlands. The Facebook group is exactly the same as my role in the old ASSAP exec, where I would daily post a roundup of news about mysteries, anomalies, edge science, and other stuff that I found personally interesting or thought the members would find interesting. It was always contentious and it upset a lot of people because there was a lot of stuff about soap opera stars and ludicrous stories and stuff that well, the problem is one person's complete nonsense is another person's really interesting research topic. A common one is ladies who believe they're having sex with ghosts. Now, if you've never had that experience, you would probably think that they're just attention seeking. And there are a few very famous examples of young ladies who've actually, a lady called Brocard, for example, have made a bit of a career out of it and promoted her singing career on the grounds of that. And people used to get really annoyed with me for sharing that. At the same time, there were other people who got really annoyed when I shared spiritualist literature or when I shared parapsychological stuff or when I share skeptical stuff. And I always figure that in a news group like this, one which just exists for the purpose of sharing information and provoking discussion, it's always a good idea if people get annoyed about it because it shows that you're actually covering a wide area. And Charles Fort, from whom we take the word Fortean, had a phrase which I think is very important. He said, "One measures a circle beginning anywhere." Historically, psychic phenomena, the weird, the paranormal, have usually been ascribed to the gods, or in this case, we see the Lord in majesty and triumph, or we have ascribed them to demons. And I thought this was a rather splendid medieval page from a Psalter showing the ancient view of the world as a fundamentally supernatural one, where forces outside of our understanding act upon the world and cause all kinds of weird phenomena. And that was for centuries. Most cultures have some notion of supernatural entities. And I use that term supernatural to mean entities that don't exist within the universe as such. They are not like robins or starlings or goats or ASSAP exec members or gremlins or, they're not physical entities. They don't, if you feed a Mowgli water, it turns into a gremlin. That means it's a physical entity. These are supernatural entities who exist outside of the universe, but whose actions take place within it. And that's a very strong historical idea. Let's just quickly move on. Later on, by the 17th century, however, the notion that individuals were somehow culpable for curses and ghosts and hauntings had become more prominent. And in England in particular, it became prominent in the 17th century. And this fellow, Matthew Hopkins, an East Anglian, we don't know a lot historically about him. He possibly trained as a solicitor, and he was resident at Mistley, which is on the coast of Essex. Mistley's a rather lovely little village. It's still there today. And he was down the Fawn having a drink in the back garden one night. And he had been investigating a number of accusations of witchcraft. And during his pursuit of the witches, he had seen, as had a number of other people, a number of physical imps or demons. And while he was sitting having his drink in the garden at the Fawn, he was attacked by a black bear. Now, admittedly, even to this day, ships from Russia and Eastern Europe sometimes put in at Mistley. There is a port there. It's not a very large port, but I've seen container ships there a few times, and it is possible to sail and dock there. But I suspect that it was not a bear that had escaped from a ship or a traveling bear. Whatever it was that attacked him, he had no doubt it was a supernatural demon sent to injure him. And that was actually the problem with witchcraft. It wasn't that it wasn't like blasphemy. It wasn't praying to the devil or whatever. It was cursing your neighbour's crops, which caused their family to starve, or killing their children, or those were the kind of things that witches tend to be accused of, deeply unpleasant stuff. Maleficia. And under British law, they weren't actually accused of praying to the devil to cause this to happen or invoking a curse or using a magic spell or whatever. Instead, they usually were accused of the crime. So they were accused of murdering someone by magic. That's the problem. It's the murder. The means by which the murder is committed is just, almost by the by. But the interesting bit about this is that here we see a transition with what's about to happen. Soon afterwards, we had a movement, which I haven't got a slide for, I haven't put one up, which was the birth of hypnosis and mesmeric fluid. Mesmerism, I'm sure you've heard the word mesmerism, to mesmerize. And Anton Mesmer believed that he had discovered a new physical principle that ran between people that he called magnetic influence. He believed that people had emitted some kind of field and that other people could act upon the field by using their powers. And one of the things that he talks about is thought transference, where the attractive young lady who's under the influence of the sinister, not so sinister actually, right, charming, debonair, and highly intelligent mesmerist, he would be able to read her thoughts and vice versa. And this notion of thought transference makes its first appearance at this point in the 18th century. Now, why am I talking about this? I'll get to it in a minute. In the 1880s, the Society for Psychical Research was set up, and it was partly a response to a new religious movement from the 1840s onwards that was called spiritualism. Spiritualism took cutting-edge scientific methodology, philosophy of science, empiricism. You wanted to carry out experiments and get actual results to investigate the problem of life after death, and you do that by holding seances and attempting to contact spirits. And this whole notion that of spiritualism as an experimental religion, an evidence-based religion, is one that people nowadays would probably find very controversial. But at the time, that was the claim, that unlike older religions like Christianity, which placed their faith on scriptures and the unseen world, spiritualism is based on experiments, and it's based on pragmatic experience yourself. You go along, you talk to the spirits, you achieve what we call gnosis, an understanding of what the true nature of reality is by your own experience, but it's something that anyone can replicate theoretically. And from that, we get things like the Ouija board, the seance table, physical and spiritual mediumship. I'm going through this at a breakneck pace because it's only to explain what comes next. In 1882, the Society for Psychical Research was founded. It had, from the very beginning, two very large factions within it. One of them, headed by a fellow called Barrett, was rather sympathetic to the spiritualists and wanted to use science to investigate spiritualist claims, but believed that a lot of spiritualist mediums were damn fakes. I don't think anyone's ever doubted that there's a huge amount of fraud in that business, but he believed that there might be some genuine articles, as did William James. William James's argument was simply that if you find a crow and you say all crows are black because this crow is black, you hit something called the problem of induction. If you were to discover a single white crow, it will falsify the statement that all crows are black. And he believed that a medium he discovered called Leonora Piper was a genuine medium who had the ability to tell him things that no living person could have told him. The SPR generally, however, under Myers and Sidgwick and various other Cambridge academics, really disliked spiritualism. They really disliked physical spiritualism. They thought that it was a load of tosh. And they thought that the mediums were frauds, and they found it slightly blasphemously tasteless and vulgar, I get the impression. It was just so far from, but they were fascinated by the possibility of mental mediumship, because how else could you explain some of the evidence they were seeing? Well, if I go to a medium and ask for a message from my mother or my grandmother, in fact, for many years I did, I had a good friend who died as well. And the mode of his death was slightly unusual. And one of my tests for mediums is to ask them, can you tell me how my friend Rick died? And if they tell me successfully, I would A, fall off my chair, B, try not to laugh, and C, try and calm them down. I'm not going to say how Rick died, but it was very tragic. And in fact, Dave, his boyfriend, might be here today. So But the point is that mediums have never so far conveyed to me any information from, to my satisfaction, from a member of my own family. Now, that means that I personally have not had that experience. I have seen a few other things that have given me pause and made me believe that mediumship may have something in it. I'll talk about that later. But for the moment, the SPR were as cynical as I was. And in 1888, Stainton Moses, who was a great champion of spiritualism, Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories and believed in fairies, as subsequently occurred, and a variety of other pro-spiritualists walked out of the SPR. And the SPR schismed into two organisations, one of which joins the London Spiritualist Alliance and goes on to become a spiritualist college in London and various other institutions, and the other one remained the SPR. The SPR had a reputation as skeptics, debunkers, and dreadful people who spent their time, poking lights where they shouldn't and proving that dear sweet old ladies were not actually psychic but were just frauds. And they also went all the way to India to expose Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophist Society. They sent a fellow all the way out to India who investigated this English-Russian, well, she was a Russian actually, I think partly, but Blavatsky was a peculiar woman, an incredibly strange woman. And nowadays we understand that a lot of what was going on with Blavatsky, Russia, India, and the Northwest frontier was not just the foundation of a new religious movement, but there was also a lot of espionage and the Great Game, as it was subsequently called. And sometimes I do wonder to what extent the worlds of psychical research and espionage do seem to come together. That's quite strange. It happens a few times. Anyway, the SPR continued to investigate, and they found a series of what they found to be very compelling arguments for survival of bodily death, which are called the cross correspondences. I'm going to swiftly move past those for various reasons that I'm not going to go into. They're not important for today. What is important is this fellow. In the 1950s, J.B. Rhine came along. Now, in the 1920s and onwards, most sciences and most academic disciplines were faced with a massive problem because physics had been incredibly successful. Reductive mathematical physics and experimental physics had proven and made predictions, and it gave birth to what we now call the Standard Model. And physics seemed to be solving many problems in a way that other sciences weren't. So physics seemed to be going great guns, and everybody else wanted to be like physics. Now, if you've heard my talk on ley lines, you'll know that one of my arguments is that archaeology did much the same. Up till this period, archaeology had been about culture, race, mythology, history, and about artifacts, their inherent beauty, and trying to trace the cultures of ancient societies by learned antiquarian discourse. And suddenly it became all about chemistry and biology A levels and carbon-14 dating and experimental premises. And it became much more about numbers and about reducing things to things we could measure. And that's what J.B. Rhine does to psychical research. And he takes on board a notion that had been come up with during the end of the first phase of the SPR by Myers, Sidgwick, Podmore, Gurney, etc. Myers, who lived in Cheltenham, a dodgy character, Myers, but that's another story. He's a hero of mine in some ways, but in other ways he was deeply flawed. But Myers, he came up with this notion that maybe it wasn't down to spirits, maybe it wasn't down to supernatural powers as we understand them. Maybe the medium was reading somebody else's mind. You didn't need to actually invoke the dead. If the medium told you what happened to your friend Bill, it was because they were reading your mind. And he called this notion telepathy, which was feeling at a distance, essentially. Other words, older words, were used as well: clairvoyance, seeing at a distance, but telepathy was the general term. And that stayed the word that was used for what was previously called thought transference. And from the very beginning, the SPR carried out huge numbers of experiments with packs of ordinary playing cards, trying to get people to guess the colour, the suit, or the number on a card. Now, anyone who's ever seen a stage magician will know the problems with this. There are so many ways you can force it, etc., etc. And in the 20s, the Germans developed a new term, which they called ESP, extrasensory perception. And that's what we now call being psychic. It's the idea that ESP or telepathy is nothing to do with the dead. It's nothing to do with spirits. It's the idea that many things can be explained by humans having a power that isn't generally understood. And it's usually assumed to be associated with the brain, and it may be associated with certain personality factors, and it may be associated with certain genes. And there's been a lot of work on what factors make people more psychic. But demons, spirits, gods, and angels out of the window. The supernatural has gone. They need a new term for it. And a term that's developed in the 50s or 40s and 50s is paranormal. And paranormal is supernatural, supposedly supernatural phenomena. But the difference is that one day they'll be explained by science. So one day they will just become part of science. So the paranormal is the waste bin of science where things that we don't understand yet go until they're recycled and either added to a scientific discipline or rejected as nonsense. So cryptozoology, to take a paranormal field, is the study of mystery animals that may or may not exist. Now, one thing you'll notice that I often stress is that we discover new, I think it's about 15 a week at the moment, new species are discovered. And sometimes they're new woodlice, or they're tiny ants, or they're some species so small that nobody's never noticed them, or the difference is so small that it can only be told by genetics. But on other occasions, they're actually quite large animals. So it's not that we're not discovering animals. You know, zoology is constantly discovering animals, but cryptozoologists tend to be a bit more excited by the sexy ones, by the giant dinosaurs, by the Yeti, and some cryptozoologists like Richard Freeman are actually serious zoologists who go to Mongolia to look for the Mongolian deathworm. But that's an example work on the Mongolian deathworm of the attempt to treat that as a paranormal phenomena, one that will eventually become part of science once the species is identified. So the paranormal is very different to the supernatural, and that's key to a lot of the work I do. Anyway, let's move on. The 1950s, Bewitched. Did anyone actually watch it? You're probably all too young, but it was amazing. It was a lot of fun. It was witchcraft reinterpreted. She wiggles her nose and she causes amazing things to happen. And it was a great show. And it was in many ways the beginning of a new way of looking at the whole world of the supernatural. Again, it's human agency, but there are also, demons and spirits, but she's the person with the magic power. It's wish fulfillment writ large. And Bewitched, I think, has a lot to do with what's going on in the 50s. Now, J.B. Ryan, the previous fellow over here, had founded a new institute at Durham in North Carolina, and he was attempting to counter godless communism by showing that there was more to the world than just materialism. He was quite keen on proving, and his wife actually was even more so. She was much more interested in what we call spontaneous cases, in ghosts and apparitions and weird coincidences and stuff like that. She collected a vast archive of them and did some work, which is totally ignored compared with JB here. But Louisa was probably, to my mind, the better scientist. But nonetheless, let's move on. JB used his friend Zena, who was Hungarian, I think, by birth, but lived in America, and they came up with a deck of cards. And they attempted to use massive scale experiments to prove the existence of psychic powers. The end result of this from the 1960s onwards under Dunajan at Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Unit was they used computers with random number generators, and they tried to show that human consciousness could affect them. And it did appear to affect them, actually. The results are massively significant, but at such a tiny level for any given trial. And the other thing that they found in their research, if I remember rightly, and I'd have to check this, is that star subjects, a very small number of people, produce nearly all the positive results. Anyway, the notion of ESP comes along, and what happens when you've got the notion of ESP? Well, the paranormal becomes another branch of science that needs proper controls, proper protocols. And in 1951, Jack Williamson, he's our hero here, wrote a novella that was published in Astounding Science Fiction. And in it, he introduces a new word, a science of psi, a science of ESP, where ESP is found to be actually working on an unknown particle, not the muon, not the hadron, not a lepton. It is a psion. And so he calls the science of using psychic powers psionics. And so that's invented in 1951. And it's taken up and popularized by John W. Campbell, who was the editor of Astounding Science Fiction and Amazing Various Other Science Fiction things. He is the father, in many ways, of a lot of modern American sci-fi writing. And he was really keen on this notion that psionics was a science of the future. And in the future, we would have whole societies based upon psionic powers, and that these would give us kind of Superman type super abilities, and that psionics was something that we would learn and harness as in the future. So the term psionics becomes adopted and is used in the science fiction community. And psionics makes its most mainstream appearance, maybe, in the Vulcan mind meld seen here on Star Trek, the original series. And it becomes part of the whole sci-fi world. Why did it become a part of science fiction? Well, psionics became part of science fiction because it was believed to be, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, cutting edge science. It was believed that by the end of the 70s, the end of the 80s, the end of the 90s, whenever, we would have mapped out the rules by which psychic powers worked, and everybody would be able to be trained in them and use them. And that therefore they would just become like anything else that we use in our day-to-day life, any other new technology. The Soviets took the idea seriously. They called parapsychology psychotronics, and in the Eastern Bloc there were various attempts made to build electronic devices to amplify psychic powers and to allow you to use them more efficiently. And then this happened. In 1974, a new game called Dungeons and Dragons came out. And I think you only have to look at supplement 3 here, Eldritch Wizardry, which was 1975, and look at the cover to see the appeal of this to teenage boys. And Eldritch Wizardry, this is the 3rd supplement for Dungeons and Dragons, contains a whole series of rules for psionics. And they've always been controversial in the Dungeons and Dragons world, because a lot of people are, well, what's psionics got to do with fantasy? We have magic in D&D. We have clerical magic, the work of the gods. We have magic that comes out of the magician, the magic user. What's psionics? But the thing was that psionics allowed any character to have weird powers. And they were very popular with some and very unpopular with others. On the left, there's another role-playing game that included rules for psionics from 1977, Traveller. And Traveller has its whole culture, the Zodani, or if you want to pronounce it the Russian way, the Zodani, who are psychic and who live in a whole society that is predicated upon psychic powers. The nobility are all psychic, and if you're born a psychic, you become a noble. And the proles live in a happy kind of mind-controlled state, where their happiness is mandated by the aristocracy who use psychic powers to keep them all in a kind of constant blissful condition. And whether that's a utopia or a dystopia depends on your take on the setting. But by the 70s, the notion of psionics had entered gaming. And since that point onwards, it's become part of the water we swim through. And the next huge thing, I didn't actually put a picture of him up because he's particularly litigious, was an Israeli nightclub entertainer and magician called Uri Geller, who managed to convince, and may or may not, I mean, who knows now, but The SPR investigated him and very quickly came to the conclusion he was a showman and not a fraud. But certain American think tanks were convinced he had psychic abilities beyond those known to anyone. And since that time, he has sometimes hinted that it's all showmanship and sometimes insisted it's not. But I think we all know that he was known to stop clocks and famously bend spoons. And there's some fascinating papers in. Martin Gardner wrote a book in the 50s, which was updated in the early 70s. I can't remember the name of it, but there's a lot of stuff there on Geller that is well worth reading. So Geller, again, made the psychic really important in our view. So what's that got to do with me? Well, a year ago, ASSAP went a bit weird, and I resigned after an incredibly traumatic meeting. And they recently tried to get me to come back, mainly because they wanted to make sure that I didn't side with another ex-exec, which was unlikely given our falling out. But they asked me if I'd come back, and I said only if you hold elections. And those haven't happened. And anyone who stood for election and was nominated has since been thrown out. In fact, there are people here who have been thrown out and who stood for election, quite a few of you. And there are people here who nominated those who stood for election, at least two of us I can see, and we were subsequently thrown out as well. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk about what I've done since ASSAP. The big idea that has overwhelmed me in the last year is that ESP comes about as a reaction to mediumship and the fact that the SPR don't like physical phenomena. They don't like objects moving. They don't like poltergeist. They don't like the kind of, this is in the 1880s. And when the mediums leave, they don't want any truck with that. So they invent this notion of thought transference, which had always been around, but they make it much more important. And the question I asked myself was, is there anything like ESP in the Bible? No, not really. I mean, talking asses, yeah. Prophecies, burning bushes, sure. Visions of God, yeah. Voices being heard, certainly. But there's not anything that I can think of as thought transference, as a mind talking to another mind. Okay, what about medieval mythology? Well, one of the things that people will tell you quite often is that ideas can come into our culture and become really important, and we just take them for granted without us ever questioning them. So, was telepathy based on any real historical cases? I couldn't actually think of any. There's a few cases of poltergeists who seem to say out loud what people are around them are thinking, or who tell people secrets or call them out. My mother, when she died, I stayed in the travel lodge on the edge of Forever, which is at Hawley on the A14, between Stowmarket and Bury St Edmunds. And while I was there, I had cause to look up the poltergeist of Dagworth, who existed in the 12th century. And he was known for hiding out in the manor house and telling people gossip. He would explain all of the lies people had told, or all of the secrets they had, or their dirty little, secrets that they didn't want anyone to know. He would shout them out. And if people came to see him, people came to the house to see what the spirit was doing, because he picked up chairs and tables and did the usual stuff. He would say, "You're so and so, and you're sleeping with X's wife, and you're the miller, and you shortchanged." And this is the kind of story, the impression you get. I translated it from the Latin from Ralph of Coggeshall, and on the morning of my mother's funeral, when I was writing a review, I still remember this because I was in the travel lodge and I'd never been able to work out where Dagworth was, but I was looking at an old map and I found Dagworth Junction was the railroad junction at Hawley, and I discovered that Dagworth was the name of where the travel lodge is. So the location of the poltergeist was actually the location of an extraordinarily remote travel lodge where I was sitting. It's just a coincidence, but it seemed like a meaningful coincidence at that moment. And, it's that kind of thing that interests me. But apart from that, there's not a lot of examples that I can find of thought transference. In the 19th century, it's sometimes ascribed to Aboriginals, and I use that term generally to mean natives of any society who Western explorers felt superior to. They sometimes, Australian Aboriginals in particular, native Australians, I think would probably be the better term, are sometimes said to have peculiar powers of mind reading or the ability to send messages at a distance. But the idea really only picks up in the early 20th century. And I found that interesting. Thought transference is really an invention of Mesmer in the 18th century. There's not a lot of evidence of ESP historically. So was it just that it was being culturally misread? I don't think it is. So I decided to experiment. The first experiment was very simple. I was still in ASSAP at the time, and I posted one evening on the ASSAP Facebook group. I chose a picture from my phone, and I don't know, does anyone know where this is, by the way? It's Black Cat Roundabout outside Bedford, between Bedford and Witherspoon.
It doesn't currently have the black cat, though. It's been
No,
stolen, apparently.
it's taken down for the roadworks, and they don't know where they've put it, but they'll find it again, no doubt.
Oh, okay.
They lose it quite regularly. I wrote to them to ask a couple of weeks ago. It was put up in the 1930s. And do you know the story? When they constructed the first roundabout, they found a black cat and its litter of kittens. And the road workers adopted the kittens and the mother. And eventually they were moved. They went on with the builders to go home. You know, they were all taken home because they were feral cats, but they befriended the builders. And the black cat, they made a tin sign, which was the original black cat. And over the years, the black cat has taken on various forms, but here we see him as he was in the 2010s, I think. So the black cat is it's a road mark for me, because whenever I saw the black cat, I'd take a photo of him, because it meant I was going home to see my mum and dad and they were still alive, or I was coming back from seeing my mum and dad and they were still alive. And I know that seems a fairly bleak way of looking at things, but for years, every time I went home, I'd take a photo of him, usually on the way back, actually. Anyway, Black Cat, I chose it as a photo because it was something that was meaningful to me that I didn't think anybody in ASSAP would know it was meaningful to me. Having chosen it, I set a time and I sat and I stared at the screen. And I asked people to enter the coordinates of a location in England, Scotland, or Wales. And I said it was a notable landmark. There was a physical thing there. And that while I couldn't travel to it physically, I was going to be watching a picture. And this is the principle behind remote viewing, except in remote viewing, they would often actually send someone to the location. And ASSAP had done some work on it, and the CIA and the KGB and everyone else, no doubt, had tried to use remote viewing for psychic spying. I, however, thought it was a load of baloney. Can anyone guess what the result was? I can't remember, and I don't have access to the group to check how many people tried, but I'd estimate about 20 or 30 people tried. And they had the whole of Britain, and a large number of people went for the Tower of London or Stonehenge. There was a clustering of famous landmarks. There was also, however, some random, seemingly random spots, which when I looked up the locations turned out to be in the middle of fields. And then there was Tim Gunter. Now, Tim Gunter's an unusual fellow, traffic warden these days, doesn't believe in ghosts, doesn't believe in psychic powers, complete skeptic, big fan of Dawkins and co, thinks it's all rubbish, but used to come along to ASSAP stuff because I ran it. And, you know, he knew me. And Tim was of the opinion that it was an impossible task. But he said, do I get a box of Jaffa cakes if I do it? And I said, sure. He came up with a location, which is a roundabout on the outskirts of Bedford. It's just over 1.5 miles away from Black Cat Roundabout. It is the next roundabout. And he said, it's a roundabout on the outskirts of Bedford. Here are the coordinates, and gave me the coordinates. He was so damn close. It was scary. In fact, I think it turned out it was 1.5 kilometers. It's about 3/4 of a mile, I think. But anyway, the point was that I then had to calculate as best I could the chances of that occurring. And it was incredibly unlikely. And he knew it was a roundabout. He said the first thing that came into my head was a roundabout. How did he know that? Well, for a moment, it almost convinced me that ESP was real. But I still to this day don't know how Tim did it, and neither does Tim. And when I asked him about it, he said, well, it must have been coincidence because psychic powers don't exist. Do they or don't they? Well, that interested me. Now, this is my mum and dad. Many of you know them or knew them. They're both dead now. And the important thing in this photo is my mother has a pen in her hand. Why does she have a pen in her hand? All of my friends think that they were staring at each other lovingly on their 60th wedding anniversary, or was it 70th? Might have been 70th. But anyway, they were married for an awful long time. Actually, they were in the middle of an argument over my mother wanting to get on with putting the horses on, and my father saying, you silly cow, you never know what you don't know what the newspapers are, blah, blah, blah. And they were joking with one another and messing around and threatening to kill each other as usual. And that look is one of them like glaring at one another and then laughing. So it's very much my parents. But anyway, they were quite addicted to horse racing. Why were they addicted to horse racing? Because they had no money. Now, if you've got no money and you really are broke, then one thing you can try and do, as they tried, was to put 20 pence on an accumulator on 7 horses. And say the first horse comes in at 3-1, well, that gives you 60 pence going on the second horse. If the second horse comes in at 30-1, it gives you, 30 times 60 pence. If all 7 come up, you walk out with 15 or 20,000 pounds, which they did a few times. And on sheer probability, if you bet every day and you keep your bets down to £1.50, the ridiculous odds are such that hopefully, if you know a little bit about horses and you're not just guessing at random, you will occasionally make a big payoff, but more often you'll come back with slightly more than you started. However, like anyone, they believed that they couldn't beat the bookies. They eventually realized that, but they decided they were going to keep doing it. So what's that got to do with this? Well, my next experiment, which I did when I was in ASSAP and then tried again when I set up the new group, was very simple. I took the day's racing. I took the first, I think it was the first 4 or 5 races at Newmarket or Chepstow or a randomly selected meeting. But I only included meetings which had at least 6 or I think it might be 7 horses. And then I put the name of the horses into an AI. Now, whatever you think about AI, and yes, there are many problems with it, but one thing it's really good at is drawing ridiculous pictures in different art styles. So Battle of the Bulge, Hardy Viking, I don't know what they were, but each of these is a photo generated from a horse's name. And in fact, as you can see, you couldn't actually really tell the name from the picture. That was actually intentional. I wanted a symbolic picture, a symbolic rendition of the name. That's what I asked it to draw. The reason I did it this way was if I'd put the horses' names, people might have worked out what I was doing and got a copy of the Racing Post or the Sun or the Mirror and looked up the odds, and that would have spoiled the experiment. Then what I asked people to do was, could everybody please choose a series of options? And so for each race, they were given the field, but they weren't told they were horses. They weren't told what they were betting on. They were just asked to choose a picture. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. Now, usually in a psychic research experiment, what you'd then do is they were told that the deadline had to be before the races were run. They didn't know why that was the deadline, but it was the deadline. So everybody who took part, and that probably includes many of you, chose from these options a number of pictures. And what I did then was I looked at the ones which came up the most and went down the bookies and backed them and I didn't really. No, I didn't have enough money, unfortunately, so I might try that. If I was to run it again, I'd be very tempted because some people really broke the odds. Bearing in mind they knew nothing about what it was they were doing. They didn't realize they were gambling on horses. I started everybody with a hypothetical £10. Now, a mathematical parapsychologist would say, well, you've got 11 options, therefore 12 options, therefore there's an 8.5% chance of each, therefore the odds against are. I didn't bother with that. I figured that bookies deliberately skew the odds so that probability is in their favour. So if you could beat the bookies, you are clearly demonstrating something against probability if you can do it consistently. So having given everybody a hypothetical £10, I then looked at the results of the first race, went back through everybody's Google form and gave them the result, the money they would receive if they had bet £1 on that race. You see how it works? Then for the second race, again, they had £1 and they bet that on the second race, and so on and so forth. And after 3 days of this, 3 race meetings, 3 days, which is what I agreed as the protocol before I started, I calculated how much money people would end up with. And the results were quite shocking. The majority of people made, as you would imagine, a small loss. The reason it's a small loss is the bookies are just trying to, not discourage you from gambling. They want you to gamble. They just don't want you to make a profit, because then obviously there would be no money in it for the bookies. They have to make a healthy return. But what a number of people did was made quite large, sizable sums of money. Now, the problem was they didn't know what they were doing. Would it have made a difference if I told them you're actually going to be betting on the 315 at Ascot or whatever? I don't know. If psychic betting worked, people would use it all the time. And my father used to say, "You're so clever, Christian. You say you know about psychism. Tell me what the lottery numbers are." And of course, there have been a whole load of experiments done about psychics and the lottery. But horse racing hasn't usually been tried as much. The results, however, were hard to assess statistically. I still haven't actually done it. There are ways. I've got the package I need to do it statistically wise now. I can sit down and do the maths and work it out. But what I ended up with was a short list of people who appeared to be genuinely altering probability or defeating probability on horses that they knew nothing about. Okay, is that proof of ESP? Maybe, maybe not. I tried the experiment again, and a number of the same names came up. So I then thought, well, what if those people are genuinely psychic, and how do I sell their names to the Russians or the Germans or the Chinese? Or how do I exploit these individuals to get rich or sell them to an intelligence agency? I'm joking. Obviously, I wouldn't do any of those things, but I was interested in who were the psychic individuals. So I then created a classic Zedekard test, and I put it on my website. It's still there now. You can go and play with it. And it gives you a coloured Zedekard, and there are 5 symbols. You do 25, and you can do as many as you want. And again, there are people who, if you asked me, are they psychic? I would say yes. When I did all the mathematics and carried out all the calculations and looked at the number of runs, I had many, many hundreds of runs over the period the experiment ran. And I had to go through and check the data and make sure that everybody with the same email address. And at the end, the null hypothesis was correct. There was no evidence of psychic powers. The interesting thing about this particular test was it's a computer that is choosing the symbol that you will see. It sees it before you select the card, but it's not actually a test of telepathy, because nobody, not even me, nobody at all knows what the next card will be, only the computer. So it's a test of either can you read a computer's mind, which seems unlikely, inherently unlikely. And don't forget, I used a randomizer rather than a pseudo-random RNG, rather than using a random function. But even so, even if using atomic decay randomizers, only the computer knows Would it work better if there was a human at the other end? Maybe, maybe. So this is really a test of precognition. I've carried it out. The data's all available. I've put the scores up a few times, but the results were null, and I need to publish them, but I don't have a journal anymore. The next idea was based on my father's complaint that I wasn't winning the lottery. And I decided that the treasure of King John's treasure. I don't know what the time is. How are we doing for time? Carol, what time is it?
10 to 8.
Okay, I'll speed this up. So King John's treasure, he lost it in 1216, was it? Yeah, he was crossing the Wash in October 1216 during the Barons' War, and he was making his way across what at that time was a tidal area. The tide swept in, and it said that his wagon train with the royal, what do you call it? What do you call royal treasures? Crown jewels. Crown jewels were lost, as was his wealth. Now, he died at Newark in Nottinghamshire a couple of days later, and a lot of people have suggested that actually, bearing in mind that they stole the clothes off his body before it was cold, and that the servants made off with everything that wasn't nailed down, it's entirely possible that the treasure was stolen then, or that the treasure was stolen by his own followers while they were making their way through East Anglia. There are those who say that there was never a gold and silver treasure. But actually, there is a significant amount of evidence for it. And so far as I'm aware, nothing has yet ever emerged. Now, this got me interested in the idea of lost treasures. And one of the reasons for this was it Speed? I've got his grimoire here somewhere. A few years ago, I was working on a role-playing game supplement for a game called Maganomia. Not Magnolia, Maganomia, which is a game about Renaissance Elizabethan sorcery, Elizabethan wizards and magicians and witches. And you run around in the age of Shakespeare casting magic. And in the course of it, I looked up a Cambridge manuscript, which was a genuine Elizabethan grimoire. And I discovered an awful lot about the kind of occult practices and magic that the Elizabethan students and of magic were into. And my favorite, I'll give you a brief summary because I haven't got the book to hand. I'm going to give you a brief summary of what's in it, which is the contents page. I would estimate about a third of the entries are involving to find hidden treasure, where you're invoking spirits to find hidden treasure. And then there's a whole series which goes something like this: to invite young ladies to come to your house and make them do so by magic. To make young ladies come to your house and be favourably disposed towards you. To make young ladies come to your house and drink copiously of wine. To make young ladies dance before the fireplace in your house and sing in merriment. To make young ladies raise their skirts around their waists and dance in merriment. To make young ladies take off all their clothes and dance naked with you. You get the idea. There's loads of them. All the spells are exactly the same or variations on the same themes. They are utterly banal. Elizabethan magicians. I'm sure Dr. John Dee had better things to do with his time, but Speed's grimoire is absolute nonsense. It is the I think when I was growing up, I used to get adverts in science fiction magazines for learn how to win women by South African hypnotism. And I was like, wow. I often wondered what South African hypnotism was and how it differed from English hypnotism. Well, the answer seems to be that it's sold in sleazy adverts in the back of magazines. The grimoires, however, fascination with finding lost treasures is something that carried on into American folklore. We see it in the Roots of the Latter-day Saints. We see it in a number of other 17th, 18th, 19th century American folk grimoires. And so I decided if they could do it by magic, we can get lottery numbers using the legend of John's treasure. Now, obviously, I wanted to find John's treasure, but the problem with that was that I couldn't go around digging up large parts of the fens. And if I did, I'd have to persuade Carol to let me use the contingency people to come along and dig holes in the ground while pretending it was some kind of lark. I would like to get away with that, but I'm not sure it would work. So instead, I made a grid and said that this represents a map of the fens. On each grid, there were a random number of squares that were blue, which were inaccessible because they were underwater. And also, there were a series of numbers. Each of these squares, and after you've taken off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you have 49 squares remaining, was given a number from 1 to 49. Can anyone work out why? What requires numbers from 1 to 49?
Lottery.
The lottery. Correct. So I then asked people to psychically find for me King John's treasure by choosing 5 squares. Oops. And each of those was then converted and emailed to me as a list of lottery numbers. I then, hypothetically, because I couldn't actually afford to do it in reality, took the lottery numbers that I was sent and entered them into a spreadsheet. And when the lottery was drawn that week on Saturday, and again, the hint was that the deadline was just before the lottery drawing, I checked to see if anybody's psychic guesses of squares on the map, which again, they knew they were looking for treasure, they didn't know they were predicting lottery numbers, would have actually predicted the lottery numbers. I think that's quite a neat psychic experiment, don't you? Guess what? It didn't work, and I'm still not rich. I did actually, a few others, I did tell people after they'd given me their numbers, I did decide to email people and tell them that they had chosen lottery numbers. And that was because I had this ethical thought. Years and years and years ago, there was a fellow who was incredibly good at card guessing at JB Ryan's department. And he wasn't a wealthy man. He was a farmer, I think, and he was quite poor. And he used to just sit there and guess hundreds of cards because Ryan would pay him $1 a trial. And one day, Ryan turned around and said something like, I can't remember if it was 1,000,000 or 1,000. I think it might have been $1,000. But I'll give you this vast sum of money if you get 25 out of 25. And the chap said, okay. And the secretary and everybody else kind of stopped to watch. And he reeled off all 25 correctly. And then Ryan said, I was only joking, and gave him his $1. Strangely, shortly after that, he stopped doing it. But you can see why he was crushed by that. The poor fellow was absolutely broken by it. And in fact, he complained about it years later when he was interviewed by somebody else. Everybody who was there said they felt it was incredibly rotten of Ryan not to give him the money when he did it. Whether he did it, how he did it, no one will ever know. But it was, so I suddenly thought, what if somebody did predict? What if Carol, for example, gets these numbers right and I haven't told her their lottery numbers? And I have to tell her, well, actually, you would have won the lottery if you'd put these numbers on. So instead, I emailed people and gave them the numbers they'd chosen and said, maybe you could do something with these if you want to. I hope they didn't, because we did exactly as chance would predict. As an experiment for getting rich quickly, it failed, and it showed no evidence whatsoever of psychic powers. Which led to my final experiment. I had always been keen on Gertrude Schmeidler's work. I'll talk about that in a moment, very briefly. So I took a picture, 1960s board game style, of a haunted house. And how it was supposed to work was you take your mouse and you click on a building. Let's go back. You can go to my website, www.cjroma.com, and try all of these. And you click on the different rooms and you're trying to find the ghost. And each turn, each of your guesses, and you get 10 attempts, the ghost's position is chosen by the computer. So you're trying to predict, kind of battleship style, where to look to find the ghost, okay? So you've got a 1 in 10 chance of getting it right. And there is a score chart on there, and you can go and look at it. And what you will discover is that some people are apparently incredibly psychic. some people score massively over chance expectation. Now, the actual scoring system is quite oblique. I designed it in a way that encourages you to score high. The more you get right, the higher your score, but it's not a simple 1, 2, 3, 4. It's an exponential. So if you get them right in a row, it multiplies the score to give you a higher score. But it's meant to work like a 1980s computer game. I don't know if you get that from the graphics. So if anyone wants to have a go at this in a while, I'll post after tonight, I'll post the link so you can go and play it. It still works and it still records data, though the cutoff point for the data has occurred. And the really weird bit about this one was, again, it seems to suggest that some people are psychic. If you perform all of the maths correctly, I don't know what the outcome is because I was distracted by ASSAP stuff today. And instead of finishing working through the data from these experiments. So ESP, I'm doubtful historically it's a real thing. I think it was invented largely, firstly, as thought transference during the era of Mesmer and during the hypnotic era, Charcot, etc. I think that it became popular because it was a good way of getting rid of spiritualists and saying, oh, it's just psychic powers, it's paranormal, not supernatural. And I wonder how, in 100 years' time, how different the way we look at things will be. But I am, in my own small-scale way, trying experiments and still trying ideas to test if these things are real. And one of the more interesting ones I tried, here's Gertrude Schmeidler. She was a fantastic woman. She died in 2009. I never met her. The era when she was involved in psychical research was the 1960s. I was not even born. However, she came up with this idea called the quantitative investigation of a haunted house. If we go back a moment and pretend this was our haunted house, you give people a map of the house and you send them in with somebody who knows nothing about the history of the building, and you ask your psychic claimants to go around and record on squares, so it can be mathematically analysed, where they think people have had experiences, and you ask them to write down their impressions. And you try and develop quantitative data that can be tested against a baseline. Then, using somebody else who doesn't know, because if you send in somebody who knows the stories, their breathing and non-verbal communication will almost certainly give it away. You send a skeptic in to go around and to investigate the house and to make a note of where people would imagine a ghost to appear. And then finally, your CJ has meanwhile interviewed everybody who works in the house or the property or the building or who lives there and has recorded meticulously on maps all the data as to exactly where it occurs. And we did this in the 1990s or early 2000s. I think it was actually possibly 2003, something like that. The Everyman Theatre in Cheltenham. And we sent round a number of people who were supposedly psychic with individuals who didn't know the stories. And we sent round a number of skeptics. And we compared what they said haunted the place and what information they could give us about locations and spots. And there was one individual, and my friend Lloyd Graney, who had a very, very strong correlation between what the witnesses had reported and the locations that were found. And he certainly would not have had access to that data because only I at that point had carried out the interviews. So I found that really quite interesting. A guy called Ross Andrews, he's in a band called Frankenstein's Lobster, and he carried out some experiments using the same protocol. He calls it sensory mapping, but it's just Schmeidler's idea. And that's something that I was keen to try with ASSAP that never happened because of the endless arguments, fighting, and the nonsense of people reporting another for being terrorists or the usual insanity. Anyway, we won't go on to that now. We'll talk about that afterwards if anyone's interested. Let's move on. So, Gertrude Schmeidler, her ideas, I cover them on my blog. You can find her paper in the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research, which tragically appears to have been hijacked by... Oh, no, sorry, that was another psychical research group. No, that is the one, yeah. the ASPR, you can Google what's happened to them. And well, that's what I've been working on. The last thing I'm doing at the moment is sorry, I've sat on my hat. The last thing I'm working on at the moment is back in 2019, I asked people to keep a journal, might be 2020 actually, to keep a journal of weird events, anomalous events that occurred in their house. This is something that I had run as an experiment based on Haran and Langer's classic 1990s experiment where they only used one couple, which in my opinion is pretty much worthless as a way of carrying out any kind of research. I managed to run it with 4 couples of replication. I then managed to get up to 9 households took part, and we got useful or usable data from 9 separate households. And some of the people who took part in that are here. And that data is really interesting. And for some reason, it shows you how stressful it's been the last 5 years, that despite having all of the agreed protocols, everything was registered before, all of the data is still sitting quite safely, secure. And I have gone through it and I have changed the names of the individuals to colors. So you've got Mr. Pink, Miss Yellow, Mr. Green, Mr. Blue, whatever. So you can't see who they are. And this is another way of looking at psychic research. Because what happened in those cases is some people experienced nothing, but other people had deeply weird experiences. And every time I run this test, I've run it twice now, both times, some people have experiences which actually seem quite batshitly weird, but they soon forget about them. So one of 2 things is happening. Either they are actually forgetting what is going on, or they are and that, we just forget paranormal events really quickly, which is something I've been working on as a hypothesis for some years. I can explain the data another time. Or secondly, they're just making it up and forgetting about it for that reason, which I think is very unlikely because the way we did the study. Regardless of that, I'll publish it at some point this month. And there's a whole load of other experimental data that I need to get out there, because otherwise we have what's called a file drawer effect, which means that negative studies like mine, where you test something, often don't come up, aren't published, and therefore that means that if you do a meta-analysis where you put lots of studies together, you get a false positive result. So I'm going to be as honest as I can about getting this data into the public domain. So, cut a long story short, I left ASSAP, set up a group where anyone can post whatever they want, basically, but it's just designed to be the usual news and stuff, and stay out of the politics. There is no group, and I'm not going to find another group, and I'm not going to be involved in another group because they always end in people doing bizarre things, and I just can't be bothered with it anymore. I've lived through it all too much, and I've put up with too much crap from people. Psychically, psionics is a modern notion. ESP has only existed as a notion for 100 years or so. Telepathy, 140. Thought transference, 250. They're a modern way of looking at the world where we take what were once spiritual phenomena, deeply mystical, supernatural phenomena that told us something about the nature of reality or God or demons or man, and we've reduced them all down to physics formulas, and we expect the ghosts or goblins to intervene in our dice rolls or whisper to us the secrets of the cards. But at the end of the day, this reductionist approach, I think, it's epitomized by one of my favorite films, Ghostbusters, where ghosts are basically slimy physical entities which can be whacked down by particle accelerators and new physics and stored in a containment grid, and where the supernatural is rendered absolutely paranormal. It's all just misunderstood physics, if you like, or consciousness persisting. So there is a kind of life after death kind of a notion to Ghostbusters, but it's very reductionist. It's a thing about scientists fighting the supernatural. And maybe it's not for scientists to fight the supernatural. Maybe we should be addressing it through persons, not principles, not looking for formula and expecting results, not invoking numbers and expecting mystery. Maybe the old method is right, and there is actually a religious or supernatural or mystical element to the world, and we're missing it because of the nature of our science. I'm going to stop talking there. I'm just quickly going to, for the sake of those who didn't see my slide at the very beginning, a while ago, I was asked by the ASSAP exec if I would appear and meet them, and they wanted to talk to me because they were concerned that Kieran Farrell was going to come back. Kieran is a pain in the ass many times. He's a nice guy. He's got his own agendas, and he's a good bloke in many ways. But he also was a complete arse when I was trying to deal with him last year. And I said, I'm not going to enter into an agreement with Kieran. I'm not interested in that stuff. I'm not interested in coming back. I'm not going to get involved. Please leave me alone. That was basically. They then asked me, would I be willing to return to the ASSAP exec? And I said, no. This was Stephen Norrie. Dave Ball actually organised it. And Dave Ball said that they wanted to hand over the organisation to somebody else. They wanted to step down and to get, would I be willing to come back and organise elections? And I said, sure. Yeah, of course I will. And where did I put that slide? Let's just go back. If we can stop the recording now. Oh, did we record that? Yes, we did. Anyway, I didn't record it, but Carol has. Carol